Labas Veritas. Pastor Marian has shared with us these past few weeks a series of sermons on the story of Samson. He focused on the character flaws of this Old Testament hero that would lead to his tragic end. And he also helped us to see what we can learn as Christians from Samson's failure to live up to God's calling. Today, I would like to add on to Pastor Marian's message by presenting to you a comparison. That is, I would like to compare two flawed leaders described in the book of Judges in the Old Testament. Those two flawed leaders are Gideon and Samson. It is interesting that both men are named and commended in the book of Hebrews, the 11th chapter. The chapter commonly known as the Hall of Faith. We read in Hebrews chapter 11, 32 through 34. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David and Samuel and all the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. So both men are described as heroes of the faith in the book of Hebrews. But we know that both men were flawed, less than perfect in different ways, even to some degree, opposite ways. Gideon is an example of God using someone who goes from weakness to strength, while Samson, as Pastor Marian has shown us, is God's man who goes from strength to weakness, and then, through God's miraculous intervention, back to strength again at the end of his life. There's much we can learn from how God uses flawed vessels like Gideon and Samson to accomplish his sovereign purposes. And there's much we can learn by comparing the two men and seeing how differently they would carry out God's calling on their lives. It's important that we first understand who these men were. What was their calling? The stories of both men are found in the book of Judges. This book of the Old Testament would describe the history of the children of Israel during the period of time between Joshua and Israel's first king, Saul. The term judges can be confusing to us in modern times. We might think of a man who presides over a courtroom during a trial, but the Hebrew word really means something quite different. A more correct translation would be one who delivers and protects Israel from her enemies. More like a general or a military commander, someone that in modern times we might refer to as a superhero. The story of Gideon begins in chapter 6 of the book of Judges. Because of the rebellion of the people of Israel, God allowed the Midianites to oppress them. We read in Judges chapter 6, 1 and 6, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the people of Israel cried out for help to the Lord. Whereas Samson was dedicated to God from birth, Gideon was chosen as a young man. And seeing what he was like, he was perhaps the most unlikely of judges, the most unlikely of leaders of Israel. We see a young man who was fearful, lacking in confidence, and hesitant when it came to obeying God. But when the angel of the Lord visits him and commissions him, he makes a surprising declaration to Gideon. We read it in Judges chapter 6, 11 through 12. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite. while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." Gideon must have looked over his shoulder thinking, "Who's he talking about? He can't be talking about me." Gideon made it clear that his family was the weakest in the tribe of Manasseh, and he, Gideon, was the least of his family. When Gideon was given his first mission to tear down the altar of Baal, he would show how fearful he was of his family and the townspeople by doing it in the dark of night. When God gave Gideon the mission to defeat the Midianites, again he shows his fear and hesitancy in obeying God's command. He asks God to give him a sign using the fleece to prove that he will succeed in the mission. And he asks God to do it, not just once, but twice. We read in Judges 6:36 through 40. Then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. When he rose early next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, "Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test you just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew." And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. God is so patient with us. As we said earlier, the story of Gideon is a story of a judge or leader of Israel who, unlike Samson, went from weakness to strength. And herein lies our first lesson as Christians. Never think that you are being humble before God when you sense His calling on your life, and you say to yourself and to God, "I am not strong enough, not wise enough, not talented enough to do what God has called me to do." Just as in the case of Gideon, God will always give us what we need and empower us to do what He has called us to do. I can testify to this truth from my own life's journey following Jesus Christ. As a young Christian, the last two things in the world that I felt qualified or even wanted to do were these. One, I was not interested in doing any kind of ministry involving children. And two, I had absolutely no desire to be a missionary. And guess what? God, in His infinite wisdom, commissioned me to do both. Like Gideon, I was hesitant and fearful at first. Like Gideon, I put out the fleece to test and see if I was really hearing from Him. And like Gideon, in my case, God proved to me that I had everything I needed from Him to accomplish the ministry to orphans that He called Carol and I to do here in Lithuania. God is always faithful, and He will always empower you to accomplish the calling and mission that He gives you. As we read in the story of Gideon, we come upon another lesson to be learned. We read in Judges chapter 7, verse 2, "The Lord said to Gideon, 'The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me.'" The Lord made sure with Gideon that He, God, would get the glory. Not Gideon, not Israel, but God alone. So the story goes that through a series of tests, God would reduce the army of Israel down from 3,200 to just 300. It's very important that in our ministries we also give God the glory always. Carol and I have been in Lithuania for 12 years now. We've been Christians for over 45 years as well. We both are very much aware that anything that has been accomplished here through our ministry has been the work of God's Holy Spirit working in us. I am still aware of my shortcomings when it comes to any kind of ministry, but I always hasten to give God the glory for anything positive that is accomplished. And I get the joy of God using a weak clay vessel like me to accomplish His purposes. This is how the story of Gideon differs dramatically from the story of Samson. As Pastor Marion shared with us, with Samson, it was always about Samson, his desires, his anger, his pride. Even his fulfilling of God's calling to defeat the Philistines was not about delivering Israel. It was all about him seeking revenge for the wrongs they committed against him. God accomplished His purpose through both judges, Gideon and Samson. But what a difference in how these purposes were accomplished. Gideon went from weakness to strength because he submitted himself to God and remained humble. We read in Judges 8:22 through 23. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." And Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." What a difference in how Samson lived out his calling. Because of his sin, lack of self-control and self-centeredness, he would go from strength to weakness. Because he would not humble himself. Labasaritas. Pastor Marion has shared with us these past few weeks a series of sermons on the story of Samson. He focused on the character flaws of this Old Testament hero that would lead to his tragic end. And he also helped us to see what we can learn as Christians from Samson's failure to live up to God's calling. Today, I would like to add on to Pastor Marion's message by presenting to you a comparison. That is, I would like to compare two flawed leaders described in the book of Judges in the Old Testament. Those two flawed leaders are Gideon and Samson. It is interesting that both men are named and commended in the book of Hebrews, the 11th chapter. The chapter commonly known as the Hall of Faith. We read in Hebrews chapter 11, 32 through 34. "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David and Samuel and all the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight." So both men are described as heroes of the faith in the book of Hebrews. But we know that both men were flawed, less than perfect in different ways, even to some degree, opposite ways. Gideon is an example of God using someone who goes from weakness to strength, while Samson